if you look at a lot of the research on it, often our interests are very focused on the mechanisms of patches being created. And there's a lot of behavioral and ecological work on how fish schools, birds swarm, or wildebeest form herds. But actually there's very little on the ecological consequences of these types of actions. If we do look for functional responses, and for those of you who are not familiar with foraging, what a functional response is just how much a predator can consume as prey densities change. So typically you'd imagine if there's more prey in a room and you're a predator, then you'll be able to eat more than if there's fewer ones. But there are actual shapes to these curves, and that's what we're interested in, because when you do a lot of predator-prey modeling, you want to know how much more food the predator is going to get as the prey populations change. So from the few studies available, it looks like we get these fairly smooth increasing curves, which are called type 2 functional response curves. And it's got a non-monotonic, so a monotonic increase towards an asymptote. So at a certain point, it doesn't matter how many prey patches there are, a predator is limited by how much they can eat, and therefore it starts to level off. Now this is actually work done by John Fixell of the University of Guelph and colleagues in Africa on the herds, but there's also some theoretical work done, some very recent work, and again in this work they typically see, or at least assume, that we have type 2 functional response curves. Now what's interesting is that I've told you that there's a lot of this ethological work on group dynamics and how patches form, but very rarely is that actually incorporated in any of these types of models of how we form groups. Often the groups are sort of assumed to increase by a certain linear relationship between population size and patch density. So what I want to do today was present to you with a much better model of looking at these kinds of questions, and that's Pac-Man. Pac-Man's the greatest predator-prey model of all time. And I've modeled this predator-prey model to look at Pac-Man as the prey, who has to graze in this big plain or big lake with its little food packets, and the predator, of course, being the ghost. So throughout the 70s and 80s, there actually was a lot of discussion on how interactions between prey groups and predators might lead to ecological dynamics. And what was first realized is that when prey form groups, it increases the distances that predators have to cross to find them. And so it has a big effect on the encounter rate. However, there are some trade-offs that we have to keep in mind. It's not really all about distance. If we compare these two models, we can see that if one predator emerges, it's pretty clear through random movement that they will encounter prey more often if they are all evenly dispersed rather than clumped together. However, prey are also very conspicuous when they group together. Lots of fish, for example, are very hard to see when they're in their individual states, but when they form these large schools, they're easy to see from a further distance. So therefore, we also have to keep in mind what is the detected region of the predator. And they actually can be quite large if the schools are large in fish, and same thing goes for herds. So in this case, although it looked like the predator would have encountered more prey faster if they were dispersed, with the high detection region, this is actually a better situation for a predator feeding on its prey. Of course, for those of you who watch nature videos, there is also, detection doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be a meal for the predator. And in some cases, the ability of the herd or schools to organize themselves into predator evasion techniques is going to be really important. If they're not very well organized, the detection will likely lead to a capture. If they are well organized, they can do these complex movements and be very effective at evading predator attacks. So we have to keep those in mind, but the one I want to present to you today is an extra step forward where we think not only about the distances that the predator has to travel to find prey, but as these prey groups form, we keep in mind that that same distance applies to the prey seeking refuge in a school or in a herd. So why don't we use our predator-prey model with the Pac-Man scenario to go through a couple different prey densities using this idea that these individuals are going to have to find each other and think about how that might affect the functional response to the predator ultimately. So let's start in a situation where the population size is high. So overall is a really high prey density. And they're going to aggregate over time. To aggregate in this case, they're going to take one step forward in a random direction. And we're just going to see how these groups aggregate into different prey patches. So as we can see now, there's still a strand individual over here, but generally through this random movement, all the individuals formed at least some sort of prey aggregations. Now we reduce the population size a little bit. We run our model once more. Now we can see, of course, that the prey aggregations are a little bit smaller, but also that there's a few more individuals that did not find refuge. Now I make it even smaller. You can see where this is going. We have even more individuals now who are distributed and will not be able to find refuge, at least by random movement. And if you get really low, well, then everybody's sort of just moving around each other and nobody forms any prey aggregations. So what kind of functional response would this look like? If the predators were targeting schools or individuals at the same time, what you might actually find is that in the situations where there's a very high population size, those prey patches grew very quickly, and that made a lot of space that the predator had to travel to find them. So actually, their encounter rate would have been quite low. Whereas as the population size declined, we had more stranded individuals, and it was easier for them to be encountered based on distance alone. And so the functional response actually shows this peak at low prey densities. Now this is of course not like we see in the few studies we have. So it'd be interesting to use another model to get an idea of whether this is actually a realistic scenario, although I put a lot of faith into the Pac-Man model myself. So my study system is the pelagic zone of lakes. I study cisco, which are schooling fish. It's important to know that cisco do not school at night. So every morning they have to go through this scenario where they're going to find each other and form schools to protect themselves against their predator, which is lake trout. We spent quite a bit of work using hydroacoustics, netting, and of course some modeling to see what type of movement these individuals, both the lake trout and the cisco, are characterized by. And ideal gas movement seemed to be a very good model for them. And a great review, if you're interested in ideal gas movement, is Hutchison and Wazer, 2007. This is a really good paper for those who are interested in modeling it based on ideal gas. And we did a pretty good job. So this is the morning. This is decimal time, which means that 24 hours in one day is equal to 1. And using hydroacoustic surveys on 2 different days, the white and black dots, we see the density of individuals in the pelagic zone decrease as schools form, right? So now we're just getting these patches forming and the overall density is going down. And you can see that our model did a pretty good job of replicating that morning event. And what's important to remember is that inherent in that model is some of the other trade-offs that I've already presented to you, like detection distance. We used the allometric model of McGill and Middleback from 2006, such that if there was a school, then the lake trout and the cisco would be able to see it from a further distance than if it was an individual as a target. Okay, so to do a functional response properly, you want to look at different population sizes. So these dark lines represent different densities at night of the cisco in the pelagic zone. But you can just think of it as the dark line is a very high population, and then as the dashes get smaller, the population gets smaller. This is the change of density of individuals in the morning. Not surprisingly, they tank because individuals are joining schools and we stop tracking them. But what I want to show you is that this happens very fast, and even if you start with a really big population, they all sort of get down to low levels relatively quickly. So from the predator's perspective of foraging only on individuals, they have to do this relatively quickly. About half an hour, actually. If we zoom in later on the day, though, and we inch along, we find this interesting event where the equilibriums start to form such that large populations actually have much less individuals who are stranded during the daytime. And that's exactly what I showed in the Pac-Man model. So if you are a very small population, during the daytime you'll actually have more individuals who are stranded in the pelagic zone than if you are a very large population. So that's only for individuals. If we look at schools, we get a similar event that you might expect, that as the schools start to form, we get a whole lot of very small schools, but as those small schools start to join, we get very small densities of large schools. Again, you get the event with the fact that a larger population will make more schools very quickly, so you see that dark line is quite a bit higher than the dashed lines. What's particularly interesting, though, is if you zoom in and you keep on running this model over the daytime, the school densities don't change very much between different population sizes. So this is interesting because there's a few orders of magnitude here between these prey densities, yet the school densities are actually quite similar in every case, which suggests that actually the shape of the environment and the speed that they move is really dictating what the equilibrium of the schools is going to be. We did some field work From July to September, the population of cisco declines quite massively because they are the primary prey item of the lake trout. It goes from 6 million to 1 million. If you look at these graphs, the open bars are fish density, so individuals, and the black bars are school densities. And what you can see is that as this population declines, the number of strand individuals increases during the daytime, yet the school numbers don't change at all. This was a really interesting finding for us because it's been actually a bit of an issue trying to figure out what is the relationship between population density and school density in oceans and in freshwater lakes. It's been something which has been the focus of a lot of studies in fisheries because schools are obviously often harvested, and getting a good idea of how those two relationships work has been a priority, but they've never found it. And so what we're proposing here now is that there's an internal mechanism which explains why there's no relationship between school density and population size. If we look at the lake trout encounter rates, let's separate them between singletons and schools. So here's the singletons to remind you of that quick decline. And what we see is that actually for the highest population size, the lake trout don't get the chance to really exploit that high population because those singletons are joining so quickly together to form schools. So really from the lake trout's perspective, having a high population is not a good time to be foraging on individuals. Whereas for the smaller population sizes, you can see that there's a much higher encounter rate for the lake trout over time. For schools, we see a bit of an opposite situation. Since very few schools are formed for the low population sizes, there's very low encounter rates for the lake trout when they're foraging. However, what's interesting is that the differences in encounter rates are not that huge between the very high population size and the mid population size. So what this means is that as we look at schools form, the functional response is going to change over time because we're going to have a constantly changing environment of singleton and school densities over the daytime. So what would be a good idea is just to take a few slices of the day, so at 1 hour after sunrise, 2 hours, 3 to 8 hours, and look at the different shapes of the functional responses over that time. What you see is at the first hour, you get that very sort of type 2 response. So this is the density of the population, or the population size. This is our encounter probabilities. At 1 hour, you can see as the population gets larger, the encounter probability does actually get larger across all the schools and individuals for the lake trout. However, very soon afterwards, we start to get these more unusual functional responses. A little bit more like what was estimated with the Pac-Man model. It's hard to do because I think at this point then you have to put a bunch more assumptions in how the predator is actually sampling the prey and how long it takes them to digest and things like that. But if you were just to sum up these kind of encounter probabilities over the daytime, over minutes, to see what the relationship was, you'd still get something which looks a little bit more like our predictions from the Pac-Man model than we would have had, than what's more commonly found, which is the smooth increase of the type 2 response. That might explain why, when you look at the field data for our system, as the cisco have declined over the last 20 years, we've actually seen an increase in foraging rates for the lake trout. So the lake trout are actually doing better now that we have low population sizes of cisco in this lake than they were doing before when the population sizes were quite large. So that's exciting for us because we're actively trying to manage lake trout populations, and the cisco were initially introduced into the system to make them into a more trophy fishery. And understanding now that there's actually a more complex dynamic between the cisco population size and the benefits for the lake trout gives us some insight into when we should get concerned when their prey fish population starts tanking. So I think I can just leave it at this tweet. That is still a take-home message. As prey individuals form groups, the change in patch densities creates uncommon predator-prey functional responses. And that if we're going to move forward and do more mathematical modeling of the predator-prey relationship, it's no longer appropriate to use these linear relationships between prey density and patch density, which is commonly what you find in most predator-prey models. And we have to use something which is a little more realistic in terms of how the individuals actually form groups. And for that, I suggest the ideal gas model, as it actually is very well incorporated with some of our classic predator-prey models like the Lotka-Volterra. With that, I thank you, and I also thank the people I've worked with, as well as my funding sources. Yes?
Is it possible that that could be confounded by changes in age class structure in the population? Like maybe as more juveniles enter the population as the summer progresses, maybe they have different schooling behaviors. They tend not to school as easily, or they can't find each other. Have you segregated your data off or sex or age class?
Well, that's an excellent question, and luckily we don't have to. They are so predated that finding a 3-year-old or 2-year-old Cisco is extremely hard. The vast majority of these schools are actually young of years. And so there really is, you can, thanks to hydroacoustics, once they break apart at night, you can get really good proportional sizes of how many of this size bin do you have versus this size bin. But it's amazing. With that high mortality rate, the number of yearling plus that we're looking at in these surveys is just tiny. So we don't have to worry about that. But it's a great question, because it could very well be. For example, often some of the older fish will dive down. So larger fish will tend to be a little bit deeper, and so the light regime might be different, which would change their schooling abilities and probably lead to more stranded fish. So, great question.
I really liked your graph, the last one. And I was wondering, what do you think about the stability of that situation? Because what you're actually showing is the rarer the prey is, the more the predator eats. And that doesn't seem very stable.
Interesting, eh? Yeah. The fact is, though, that type 2 curves are actually not always that stable either. So I was thinking about that too. I was wondering whether this actually led to a less stable system or a more. And one of my co-authors on this, Peter Abrams, has released a few papers which tries to examine the stability of the type 2 curve. And to give a sort of a relative which one's more stable is very hard to do. But I think what you might see, and this is very common in fisheries, is that you see sort of a buffer effect where there's not much change in your population, and then there's an immediate decline. And you see that a lot with overfishing, that no one thinks it's a problem, and then all of a sudden the population tanks. And I feel like that might be a danger with this, is that you'd see an increase in their foraging ability as the prey population was falling, and then you'd see a tank when everybody, basically the bottom dropped out of that food web. Do we have time for more? Or?
As long as it's short.
Sure.
Fish can always talk about the morning bite and the evening bite, and I look at your patterns there and I go, that seems to make sense from a fish's perspective, but then fish also sort of shut down as well. I was wondering if you had thought about sort of the behavior that might result from the predator's side of things, that spotting these kinds of fluctuations sometimes in the day.
Yes, so lake trout are highly dial in Lake Opeongo, the system we're looking at, in terms of their activity. But if you actually look at in terms of their foraging, they feed quite consistently on schools during the day. And so there's an interesting question of whether in the morning they're more active because they're chasing singletons, like in stranded individuals, and in the daytime they're less active because they can just sit there and wait for a school to go by. That's quite probable, that they have that switch in foraging behavior. And that's actually part of the reason why I didn't want to put too much emphasis on that last slide with the cumulative functional response, because that's exactly the type of thing which you'd have to really take into account when summing up all the encounter probabilities. Thanks.
Okay, next up we have Dane Ward, new